So Amani Perry, who teaches African American Studies at Princeton, left her home in New Jersey and took a trip down to Maryland, trying to recover a little bit about one of her ancestors from the state, who was either named Esther or Easter. It was really impossible, you know, records for slaves have not been well kept. And there was an Easter Lowe who showed up in the 1870 census. She was 101 at the time. She had been born in Maryland. But then in 1880, she kind of reappeared, and now she was Esther Watkins, and she was just 91, and she had been born in Georgia. And that's kind of the frustration often of trying to recover those people whose ancestors were slaves. And so she decided to take this trip to Maryland, but she didn't even really know where to go to find any clues about Easter or Esther. So she started off at a tavern there in Annapolis. She chose Annapolis, you know, a beautiful, scenic, coastal, historic town. And this tavern was a place where slaves had been bought and sold while people would eat and drink. It was still in business. You could still eat and drink there. She went in and she ordered something to eat. And she didn't even really know what she was hoping to see or to feel. There wasn't a marker anywhere or a monument, because to be honest, buying and selling slaves was so ordinary in a country that had 4 million. The slaves were sold everywhere. I mean, we have that idea of an auction block, but that's really kind of more theatrical. I mean, slaves were sold in taverns and town squares and church steps and by the side of the road. And she just felt this emptiness. There was no sign, no clue of Easter or Esther, so she left. And then she went to a historic museum. It had been, you know, a home that had been restored. You know how it's done, the meticulous research and science that goes into restoring these homes, making sure the paint is exactly as it would have been in the day, and the fabric chips, you know, exactly what they would have been. And when she arrived, the guide looked at her and said, "I'm sorry, but we're trying to redo the exhibit so that we show a little more fully the lives of the slaves who had lived here." I mean, you know how it is. There's all kinds of detailed record about the white families who had owned it and sold it and passed it on, but almost nothing about the slaves who had lived there and worked. So they'd started off, they walked through the dining room where at one point these elaborate feasts had been served, and then they went into the kitchen. And the guide pointed out that the slave who cooked had to be this enormous storehouse of knowledge, that not able to read or write, forbidden, of course, to read or write, she had to store all the recipes and all the proportions and understand science and heat conduction and how to cook all of these things. And then she also pointed out that that kitchen would be the slave's home as well. Where she slept there on the stone floor, and in the winter it would have been freezing cold, and in the summer sweltering hot. And she left there honestly thankful that she didn't know more about Easter or Esther, or whether she might have lived in such a place. So this morning we come to a different slave girl, Rhoda. And not surprising, we don't have many details. We don't even know for sure that's her name. It was a common slave name. It meant rose. It could have just been a name given to her, like a slave owner would give a name. But she plays this bit part in this drama that Luke, the author of Luke and Acts, really wants to tell. And it's a story about Peter. Peter, who's, you know, the apostle starting the early church, he's being persecuted and now imprisoned by Herod. And Herod, as we know, was the Putin of the day. And Herod has him very well guarded. He's got 4 squadrons of soldiers watching over Peter. And now it's night, and Peter is asleep. And he's sleeping between 2 soldiers, and he's got double chains on them, and then there's more guards at the gate. And then an angel appears in a bright light, and they free him somehow. And the chains fall off, and he's led past the guards, and the gate opens on its own accord. And then he goes to this house of Mary, where they are gathering. They've been praying for him all night long, because this is to be Peter's very last night on earth. And Rhoda, the slave, hears someone knocking at the gate, and she runs to let him in. And then she's just so overwhelmed with joy that instead of letting him in, she just runs back and tells everybody that he's there. And they say, well, you're crazy, you don't know what you're thinking, you're just your typical woman, you're Anita Hill, you're Christine Blasey Ford, right? You're the woman at the tomb, we don't believe you. And then Peter's standing out there in danger and he's banging at the door, and they finally go and let him in, and he tells them what has happened, that he's been released, and then to go and tell everyone. And then, like that, Rhoda disappears from the story, and she's completely dismissed and discredited. We don't know a lot about Rhoda, just like we don't know a lot about Easter or Esther, but we could do an entire sermon, honestly, on just the fact that she shows up at all, because the church has done its best, as we know, to write women out of the logbook of resurrection, right? I mean, we know that. And yet somehow she persists, and somehow she shows up here, and somehow her voice still speaks to us. And part of that passion is in this kind of interesting clip that happens here that's humorous, where she hears this voice of Peter, and yet she is overwhelmed with joy, and she runs and she tells the others. And in that, you've got this very familiar trope of the slave, right? You've got Prissy in Gone with the Wind. Remember, I don't know nothing about birthing babies. This is a trope that began in Greco-Roman times. It's kind of the running slave. And the running slave is this foolish, gullible girl who also is controlling the narrative, right? It turns out she's really got all the power. She's got the power to free everyone. And what I appreciate in this trope, which is what feminist and womanist scholars have really begun to recover, is this woman who is overcome with joy in the face of oppression. This woman, as Margaret Amer has described, who is outrageous and bodacious and audacious, and who insists on her freedom and her place. And what I hear in this scripture, I imagine this young woman, this enslaved woman, who now is standing at this gate with this free man, this man who has been imprisoned and chained. And I wonder if in this moment, she's not hearing the words of Jesus earlier in Luke's story. Remember when he came to deliver his sermon, to say why he had come, to preach good news to the poor, release to the slaves, freedom to the captives, to give sight to the blind. And in this moment, standing there, if she doesn't also know that she is a free person. Today, Labor Day, we remember all those voices that have been dismissed and discredited, because the story of labor in this country has deliberately been lost. And all we really have from the earliest days are snippets. One of the first strikes in this country was in 1763, when black chimney sweepers in Charleston, South Carolina, went on strike. And all we know about that is a little snippet in the South Carolina Gazette, which described them as insolent and audacious and arrogant for demanding more. 100 years before the Civil War, black chimney sweepers with no protections demanded more. And then jump ahead 100 years, 1866, 1 year after the Civil War, black washerwomen in Jackson, Mississippi struck, the first full-level black strike in this country, and they took their own petition to the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, and they said, we will not wash the white women and the white men's clothes unless you will pay us this certain rate. And then they fined any woman who broke it and walked across that. And of course, we don't know what happened to that. All we know is that the newspapers called them what? Wait for it. Unintelligent and insolent, and of course said what? That they were being driven by outside agitators from the north. This is what we know from that. We know that there was a ripple from that, and in those Reconstruction years, all of that spread out, and that black workers all over the South struck, and those ripples continue today. A month ago, April 1st, two black men, Chris Smalls and Derek Palmer, best friends, co-workers at Amazon, brought the next to largest company in this country to its knees with the fledgling Amazon labor union. And we know a lot of details about that. Many of you have seen pictures and stories about these two remarkable young men. best friends, co-workers. They were 31 when they started this effort 2 years ago. Chris Smalls was 25 when he went to work for Amazon in 2015. He was a hard worker, he was productive, his metrics, he met all of it, he became a supervisor. 50 times he applied for management positions and only got 2 interviews, never was moved up. And considering what he was able to do later, you might think there might have been some racism in there. Especially the Staten Island facility where black workers were fired 50% more often than white workers. But he remained a loyal, hard worker. And then in March of 2020, when COVID hit, and we were in that situation where that facility was supplying all of New York City, and they were absolutely ground zero. The employees were under incredible pressure to try to serve all of New York City, and they didn't have the protections they needed, and workers were showing up in that March of 2020 who were sick, and they were continuing to work, and the other workers had no protection. So at the end of March of 2020, Chris Smalls led a walkout and a protest, and he was joined by like 10 people, and he was fired that very day by Amazon. And then you know what happened. Amazon turned around, they sent an email out accidentally to 1,000 people in which they called him what? Wait for it. Not smart and not articulate, and said, we're going to focus on him. We're going to put all of our attention to discredit this thug, this kid in street clothes, hip hop, instead of reminding people for the umpteenth time how really we care about our workers. And you know what happened. Amazon spent $4.3 million alone on anti-union consultants. A lot of it focused on Chris Smalls, and Chris Smalls and Derek Palmer together raised $120,000 on a GoFundMe page. And they started with a tent and 2 tables and 2 chairs. And for the next 11 months, they started gathering signatures. And it is not easy to get a union vote on any company because it takes 30% of the signatures of the employees who are current employees. And Amazon has an average turnover rate of 150%. Do you think getting the signatures of 30% of the employers in a place where sometimes they had mandatory meetings, 20 mandatory meetings a day for workers to attend that were anti-union, right? That is incredible. And you know what he did, right? With barbecues and bonfires, his mother's home cooking with chicken and baked ziti and lasagna and brownies. They created this community of incredible joy and this community of care, right? When people were sick, they were praying for them. When people needed something else, they were there for them. And when the union vote happened and they won, and that video went viral, my daughter posted it and reposted it, and I could hear her sweet voice. Have you ever seen anything more beautiful? I mean, that rainbow coalition, like Chris Small said, we don't care if you're left, right, center, white, black, green, red. We're building this inclusive, beautiful community. Amani Perry didn't find Easter or Esther on her trip to Maryland. Her very last stop was at the market house where once upon a time slaves had gathered to socialize and to do their master's business. And in that place, it was now just an upscale food mall. And she was, sad and heartbroken that she hadn't been able to find anything. And she headed for a car, which she couldn't find. She'd taken a picture of where she parked, but there was every car on a cobblestone street. She had wandered and she'd started to cry, the way you cry. We don't even know why you're crying or what you're crying about. She finally found her car and she got in the car and she just sat there for a long time and tried to think, what had she even been looking for? And then she drove home, and when she got home, she sat back down at her computer and she thought she'd look again to see if she could find anything, any clue. And she thought to look in the registry of runaway slaves. And there she found this entry, Esther, Charles County runaway notice, July 27, 1790. A runaway Negro woman who calls herself Stace. She is known to be the property of Mr. Abraham Lau of Calvert County. Her owner is requested to pay charges and take her away. She won't ever know for sure if that's her Esther. But that's her ancestor in the struggle, right? This woman, this slave who ran, this woman who gave herself her own name, this woman who believed that she could write her own story. We've come to this place today with a lot of different stories, right? We've come here, some people with traumas and terrors that someone in my skin can't even begin to imagine. And yet we've come here with a lot that we share, right? The human community, the sense of being broken and bruised, the passion for joy and justice. And we've come here, Peace Church, to affirm the God of resurrection, right? The God who is planted in every single human heart, in every single bit of creation, in the winter bees that fly, even when they've never left the hive, in chimney sweepers, and in 2 young men who brought the largest company to its knees, and more, who created this moment of overwhelming joy. This God has planted in all of us a seed of hope, a seed of justice, a seed of resurrection. This is the gospel. Thanks be to God. Amen.
Amen.